Okay, everybody, let's go ahead and get to it. And we are here for another round of Astro-Babble. And unlike yesterday's forecast, I don't have incense going that's going to blow in my face and make me all sneezy. So we're already off to a good start. Just for those of you who have not joined the live cast before, again, this is a Astro-Babble, where we're going to take 8 charts that everybody has submitted. Thank you as well to everybody who has sent in their birth dates, places, and times. And we are going to just talk about what I see in the charts. If you would like to be a part of the queue, all I need again is your birth date, place, and exact birth time. That will give me what I need to run your chart. I do need that exact time. That is something that is required. That's one of the drawbacks of astrology, is that it is extremely time sensitive, but we can still have a lot of fun. So we're going to start with these 8 charts and crack open a fizzy water and get to it, shall we? Oh, and if you want to schedule a private consult or check out some of my online classes, just go to website scorpiorisingastrology.com. All right, let's talk about Michelle. Hey, Michelle, how you doing, girl? Good morning. Well, morning here, but not necessarily morning in Ireland. We have Michelle born at 6 a.m. over in Dublin. Let's take a look at Michelle's chart. Oh, Michelle, honey, I love your chart. So we have an ascendant at 5 degrees of Cancer, which is fun right off the bat, especially because we have Venus in Cancer here in the first house. Whenever we have Venus in the first house, there's going to be a sense of beauty, there's going to be a sense of loveliness, there's going to be a sense of that Venusian archetype. Especially with that Venus in Cancer, I really enjoy Venus in Cancer because Venus in Cancer is that Octomom energy. It's a very supportive, loving Venus paired with that protective, emotional energy of Cancer, and that's the image that I see with Venus in Cancer. And the first is identification with that like super nanny, very Mary Poppinsy would be a good way to think about it. So that's what we see in Michelle's chart. Her first house of self contains that, the ascendant and Venus in Cancer. The ascendant is also making an exact trine to the moon in Scorpio in her 5th house. So we need to talk about some 5th house themes with Michelle, as well as that Venus in Cancer and the moon in Scorpio in the 5th house. The 5th house is that house of children, of parents, of caregiving, really. And because you've got Cancer on the ascendant paired with Venus in Cancer, Michelle, I really think if you have not considered being a parent, you'd actually be really, really good at it. Because we have all of this watery energy in your chart that really speaks towards being good with emotion, being good with caregiving, having your heart in that caregiving space, having a very nurturing presence. Not to mention this Jupiter and Pisces up in the ninth, honey. All of your all of the right formations to have just this watery energy take people into your life and just wrap them in this feeling of comfort. Just caregiving is a big part of it. However, I do think it's interesting that we do have Mercury in Gemini retrograde, as well as the Sun in the 12th house of hidden enemies. So one of the things that I have talked about before on these live streams is the idea when the Lord of the chart, or the Sun, in this case the Sun in Gemini in the 12th house, is in that place of hidden enemies, we find that there's a sense of self-sabotage. So although you have this very giving nature, Michelle, and it's very compassionate and it's not false in any way, shape, or form, it can be used as a compensation mechanism. And we need to understand that first and foremost, that you being able to give care to somebody else does not mean that you are more or less valuable. And you should not try to overgive to compensate for a low self-esteem. And this is something that, especially like I work in healthcare as one of my other businesses. I'm a reflexologist. I see clients on a regular basis as well with the astrology and the body work pre-corona, but when it comes to that Sun being in the 12th, we really need to understand that there is an element of self-sabotage here, especially when it comes to your own mind, your own words, with that Mercury and Gemini retrograde in that 12th house of hidden enemies. We have an issue with that astrologically in the chart that needs to be rectified. And I think that one of the ways that you try to compensate for that, but don't necessarily succeed, is you are over giving nature and you're overly compassionate nature. So as long as you understand that no matter how much you give to other people, it will not restore your sense of value. Yeah, as long as we're aware of that, we need to just take that into consideration when we analyze other parts of your chart. Let's see what else. Let's talk a little bit about North Node in Leo, ninth node, ninth node, ninth house, Jupiter Pisces ruling the sixth house. That's a fun place. So Jupiter is that most powerful benefic is what we would call it, the most positive planet in the chart. And to have Jupiter in Pisces is excellent because it's in its own sign. It loves to be in Pisces. And it is in that ninth house of travel, foreigners, higher education. So there is, and spirituality, there is an element of luck. There is an element of prosperity. There is an element of just downright positivity when it comes to those ninth house topics of, again, travel, foreigners, higher education. But that Jupiter is also ruling your sixth house of work, as well as health and pets. So it wouldn't surprise me if, for a day job at least, you really involve those elements of travel, higher education, foreigner spirituality in your day-to-day work, because that Jupiter in Pisces is a really powerful placement, and it is ruling that kind of day-to-day grind in your chart. How you make money will be very different because we do have this caregiver mentality in terms of cash flow. We do have the sun in Gemini in that 12th house of hidden enemies, but also of hospitalization, jails. I also put hospice in this category of the 12th house because how the 12th house is that place that where we put people away, or also where we put things away, where we prefer to kind of exile them or put them in that space where they can contemplate the next phase of their life. And I definitely put hospice as a signification of the 12th house too. And when we see the caregiving nature of your chart, plus your sun ruling your second house of finance here, I think that you getting a good handle on some monetary income via hospice work or working in things like prisons, rehab facilities, that kind of stuff would be a successful move for you for sure. What else do we see? We see the 11th house Mars in Taurus. That's a lovely placement. I enjoy that, especially because that Venus in Cancer is ruling it from the first house, and identification with friends, and really having a good steady friendship base that's equal parts motivating but sustainable. A lot of time with Mars, we see Mars in the chart, and when it's in its own domicile of Aries or Scorpio, it's still pretty powerful. But especially when Mars isn't in domicile rulership, it can be really hectic. But being Venus ruled definitely tempers that. And especially when we find Mars in the 11th house of friendships, there's a lot of good chemistry with friends. There's a lot of equal parts that Martian type motivation, kind of poking and prodding you to move forward, do the thing, etc., etc. But then we also have that Mars and Taurus ruling your 10th house of success, which I think is really beautiful as well. So working with large groups or being known for large groups, being known as a friendly person throughout the course of your life is definitely something that we see in the chart. We do need to be just aware of a couple things when it comes to business, death, taxes, and estates, all of those eighth house topics. We do have the South Node here. We do have the MC here, which is very interesting. And we do have Saturn in Aquarius here, retrograde, can join that South Node. That's really, really difficult, Michelle. But I think if we're able to transmute your experiences with death, as well as technically being taken advantage of from a monetary perspective, if you're able to transcend those experiences, if you're able to understand, yeah, life can be really tough, but that doesn't make life bad. All of those really tricky, sticky life lessons where you're oppressed via Saturn, but there's always some sort of intellectual understanding that you get out of it, despite energy being lost. That South Node, we can really rectify some harsher points of the chart while moving towards that North Node in Leo in the second, where you gain financial stability for the first time and realize that money does have a life of its own, but that life can be somewhat controlled should you use those skills wisely. Excellent. Good morning, everybody. So, hi, Sheila, Desiree. Albert, Kate, everybody joining on Instagram, thank you for coming on to watch Astro-Babble with me. Let's go ahead and keep running. We have 8 charts to get through, and these 8 charts have been submitted by you, the lovely viewers. If you would like to get on the queue, it's pretty long, but I'm always accepting new birth dates, places, and times, and we'll add you to the queue and get you ready for the Astro knowledge. But for now, we're moving on to our second chart. So we're going to talk about Craig. So Craig was born 4:12 p.m. in Abingdon, something like that. Abingdon, yes, which is a place. Astro Software only looks at real places. So let's take a look at Craig's chart. We do have a Libra ascendant with 2 outer planets besieging the ascendant. So when we see 2 outer planets kind of smushing or in really close proximity to a particular planet, in this case it's the ascendant, we need to be aware that there's a lot of transformation that's happening in that planet. It's almost like that planet got thrown into a pressure cooker. There's a lot of mm, there's a lot of really tough life lessons. There's a lot of karmic healing. There's a lot of generational problems that tend to be put on the shoulders of this individual. And this is really what we find with Craig. So Craig has Pluto and Uranus in Libra on either side of the ascendant. Both Pluto and Uranus were retrograde at the time of his birth. And so we have a lot of really tricky issues regarding death, regarding the underbelly of the legal system, especially from a Pluto and Libra perspective. We also have Uranus in Libra, that dishevelment that Uranus in Libra tends to, Libra being that sign of balance and also legal stuff. But specifically that balance aspect, Uranus doesn't really do well in Libra, because Uranus is the disruptive planet. It's the lightning bolt. It's that thing that comes out of nowhere and really just shocks the system. And for an outer planet to be in Libra like that, it doesn't necessarily match up. So we have a lot of transformation in the first house. We have a lot of identity crisis in the first house. We have a lot of who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? Paying attention to generational trends as well, being the stereotypical archetype for the generation that Craig was born in. And doing work with all of those themes, I think, is going to be a really important part of Craig's chart. Oh, that's a good. Yeah, I'm okay with that. I'm not super all right with that, but I'm okay with that. So we do have Venus, the Lord of the chart, in Aries. And that Venus in Aries over in the 7th house of relationships is out of opposition from Uranus. So I am pleased with that. But Venus in Aries is still in its fall. Venus does not like to be in Aries, especially when it concerns the 7th house of relationships. We find that Craig takes an approach to relationships of needing to be proven to, and it goes something like this. Hi, honey. How was your day? Oh, my day was fine. I got all of these things done. How was your day? Well, I kind of just relaxed around the house and, I did these things, but I didn't get as much done as I would like. And Craig immediately starts judging the other half for not getting enough done. Venus in Aries is very much a prove it to me kind of partner when she's in the 7th house. And so this archetypal energy, which would be loving, which would be appreciative, which would be overflowing with abundance, now has this Aryan stipulation to it of, if you're not moving forward, then I don't appreciate you as much. And so we need to be understanding of that spousal dynamic with Craig, that unless they have a partner that's high performing, Craig might not necessarily have access to some of those loving traits that a Venus in the 7th house would otherwise have. Yes. So what else do we have? We have an interesting formation with two planets that are in their detriment as well. There's a lot of detriment in Craig's chart for some reason, and I think that's something we would need to unpack. When I have a lot of clients who come to see me for astrology consults, and we see a lot of detriment in the chart, there's this feeling of, always being somewhat unlucky or always being one step out of sync with the gods, with the universe. And so here we see two more planets that are not in their favorable condition. We have Saturn in Cancer, which is in the sign of its fall, and we have Mars in Cancer, which is in the sign of its detriment, both planets not liking to be in those signs very much. And they're both in the 10th house of success, and they're both in the MC. And when it comes to long-term success, Craig has a very turbulent relationship, or a very distasteful or bitter relationship with success as a whole. And it's one of those things where Craig doesn't really like the idea of success, of power, especially his generation with the Pluto in Libra and Uranus in Libra in that first house of self. The idea of fat cats sitting on their high towers, very, very disruptive to Craig's framework and those generational planets. So not necessarily wanting to identify with those archetypes. However, there is this beautiful aspect of Jupiter in Pisces in the 6th house of work, making a trine to the MC at 15 degrees, an exact trine, actually. And that's something that I think Craig's going to need to get over a little bit, is the idea that he's actually really good at what he does. And fame is actually in the chart for him. The second house of finance is being ruled by that Mars and Cancer in the 10th. So although Craig doesn't necessarily want to be well known for what he does for a living, there is this sense of him actually being very, very good at what he does, especially with this Mercury in Gemini, Sun in Gemini, South Node, all in the 9th house of travel, foreigners, higher education, spirituality. There's a really good chance that, especially from a communication standpoint, Craig is especially like communications, writing, teaching at the higher college level or post-secondary education, that he's actually really, really good at it. Unfortunately, there's this power disruption in his chart, which says, no, I can't be good at it, because when you're good at something and when you're well known for something, that's power, and power is bad, and we can't have power because everybody who has power gets corrupted by power, a theme that we talked about on in yesterday's chart about absolute power corrupting absolutely. In Craig's chart, there's zero remediation for that. So there's a real sticking point emotionally and mentally in Craig's chart about being the best at something, also being a death sentence for Craig's aspirational desires. And that's a really difficult space for Craig to be in, because a lot of his talent is in this writing, teaching, communication space. That Jupiter in Pisces, the most positive planet of his chart, is also ruling the 3rd house of writing, teaching, communication. We have Neptune in Sag retrograde here, fantasy work, dealing with fictional writing, really milking out the dream state in a communication format is beautifully exemplified in Craig's chart. But there's this issue with the generation and with his career placements, his success placements rather, in the 10th house, where all of that detriment is really gnawing at his perspective, and needing to break through that perspective, I think, is really what Craig's chart is asking him to do. Because if he's true to who he is and his skill set, then his skills are a gift to the world, and it's not about him. He's channeling and pulling those gifts through, as opposed to identifying with the power or the ego boost that process would grant him. So that's that. Thank you, everybody who's jumping on. Tony, Valerie, Don, everybody who's jumping on Instagram, I'm seeing you. I appreciate you. Thank you for jumping on. We are moving through 8 charts this morning. We're on chart number 3. Let's talk about Dina. Hey, Dina, how you doing? Born at 6:36 p.m. in Westminster. Okay, Dina, I see you. So we've got the ascendant at 23 degrees Libra, which puts Venus as the ruler of the chart, but we have another Venus in Aries in the 7th house, as well as a Sun in Aries in the 7th house. So we need to talk about this idea, Dina, about you not only being attracted to, but also like working out with your spouse, and also making sure that your spouse is a go-getter, a super achiever, and that because that Venus is in Aries in the seventh, you over identifying with that relationship, finding a big sense of personal security or personal identity in that spouse and their success, but also that love is conditional based on progress. And that's kind of a difficult placement, Dina. I'm not gonna lie. When we think of love, we think of, oh, let me hold you, let me snuggle you, all of your flaws are perfectly okay, this unconditional Venusian archetype. Unfortunately, that's not what your chart dictates. Your chart dictates that Venus in Aries must see success and progress in the relationship, in your spouse, in yourself as well, being very, very almost addicted would be a good word to that striving forward. But especially when you choose to spend your life with somebody, if they're not hitting goals, if they're not meeting needs, if they're not striving to be better, 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 then that's a deal breaker for you, Dina. We do have this moon in Cancer though, up in the 10th. I'm a fan of that, as well as the MC in Cancer, this idea of success being very maternal, this idea of success being associated with potentially following in mother's footsteps. But we do have again the besiegement. We do have Neptune and Jupiter both in Capricorn, kind of encasing or encapsulating the moon with only help from Mercury and Taurus. That's an interesting dynamic. That also speaks towards, I've seen this in other people's charts play out as we really don't appreciate parents until they're dead. Because that fourth house is the house of family and home, and that moon is literally opposite that in the 10th house of success, feeling emotionally distant from parents but appreciating them once they pass, because the moon is applying to a sextile with Mercury and Taurus, the sign of its exaltation. So that's an interesting dynamic that you've put this very feminine, compassionate, appreciative, empathetic moon in your 10th house of success. But meanwhile, you have this oppressed Jupiter, and you have this escapist, deflective Neptune in the fourth house of family, that I think provide a little bit of context for that moon in Cancer, wanting to give love, wanting to be that maternal archetype for others, but not necessarily because you didn't necessarily receive that at home. But then also that tough love that the Jupiter opposition makes, and the Neptune opposition makes, paired with that Venus and Aries. There's a big picture developing, Dina, in your chart about relationships and how you are striving to help others succeed and yourself succeed as well, because there was this coldness or oppression or deflection of in that fourth house of family and home early on. Yeah, super interesting dynamic with all of those opposition and square energies in your chart, Dina. We would need to unpack that. But let's go ahead and look at the second house. The second house is pretty active in Dina's chart. We have Pluto in Scorpio retrograde, we have Saturn in Scorpio retrograde, and we have Mars in Scorpio retrograde, all in that second house of wealth and material possessions. Not ideal, Dina. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. The idea of Pluto, planet of death and planet of the underworld, being retrograde. Normally, I actually like to see Pluto in the second house, because Pluto in the second house is one thing that a lot of people don't talk about with Pluto is its potential for wealth. Because what happens in the underworld is all of the gold, all of the riches that are buried underneath the earth are technically the domain of Hades, the domain of Pluto. So Pluto, I see a lot being associated with large amounts of wealth later in life. But Pluto is also retrograde. Saturn is here, which is a natural planet of restriction, of lack, of deficiency, and that is also in the second house of finance and is also retrograde. We have Mars here in Scorpio, which is its proper rulership, and it is ruling the house, which is great, but it is also retrograde. Three retrograde planets in the house of finance means that your financial state is always backwards, and especially from a Saturn and Mars perspective, both being malefic planets. Although Mars is in its own domicile, having it in detriment backwards, um, that's rough for finance. So I would highly encourage, Dina, if you don't have somebody watching over your finances for you, if you don't have a CPA, if you don't have a spouse, a friend, a family member, somebody who's able to objectively look at your finances, potentially stop you from spending or auto transferring your funds into savings accounts that you can't touch without permission. When I see a monetary house that's this afflicted, I'm not pleased with it. Now that will remediate over time. Saturn is a planet that matures around year 30. Pluto is a planet that matures around year 50, halfway through the life. So I think there is a good chance that you will be able to access those resources, but you'll never really have that true ability to master money with so much harshness in that financial house. I think it's not an ideal setting for somebody to be naturally okay with the idea of money. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about in Dina's chart? I really like some of your relationship house stuff, ruling your 11th house of friendships. That Sun in Aries, besides the moon in Cancer, is the most powerful planet in your chart for sure. That Sun in Aries is ruling that 11th house of friendships. Really, really great chemistry with friends. Very solar, very radiant, very lovely because Venus is attached to it. But also the idea that you really push your friends to perform. You might also tend to find find spousal partnerships within your own friend group. So if you're looking to, find your next long-term relationship, I would be a little bit more social. I would do a little bit more networking. I would hang out with friends more because that house of friendship in large groups, as well as humanitarian efforts, potentially like volunteering, would activate your Sun in Aries in the 7th and bring some relationship possibilities into the life. Yeah, I think that's a good summary. We still need to talk about North Node and Mercury ruling that North Node in the ninth. That's tricky. But I think if we stick to the finance stuff, that'll remediate some of that. A CPA is definitely needed, especially with Mercury and Taurus in the eighth, that representing the CPA that's besieged by the negative thoughts of the Pluto Saturn in the second, for sure. I think that's really where you drive home remediation, is in those financial houses for you. Because if you're letting the idea of what's in your bank account stop you from doing the things that you want to do to improve yourself, Dina, then that's not okay. But we also need to make sure that your money isn't slipping through your fingers, as tends to be with all of this malefic energy in the second house. Okay, we're about halfway through the cast, and I haven't gotten through halfway through the charts. I apologize. I need to speed this up just a tad. So let's talk about Sheila. Sheila was born at 2 a.m. in Baltimore. We have a semi Leo stellium. We have the ascendant. Oh, Sheila, honey, darling. We need to be a little bit aware. You gave me a 2 a.m. birth time. Your ascendant is literally at 0 degrees 25 seconds into Leo, literally on the edge. A minute would change your chart. So if you are in any way, shape, or form not sure about your 2 a.m. birth time, we need to rectify that and see which chart would be better. So there's a good chance that this reading isn't going to hit the mark because you're so close to the edge of that Leo ascendant. It's absolutely like stupid ridiculous how much the reading that I'm about to get this chart would change if we didn't have that exact birth time. And that is something that I work with clients on a lot, is if you're unsure about your birth time and you'd like to consult an astrologer for what we would call rectification of the birth chart, we take a couple potential birth times that change the ascendant, within an hour or two. And we basically read both charts simultaneously, asking you questions about how your life has been thus far, the state of your relationships, finances, all the things that we've covered in the mini readings here. And then we determine which chart would fit you best to narrow down a birth time that we can actually look at via transits and things of that nature, as opposed to just winging it, because then the whole reading is off. And I've actually had to do that with multiple clients where we change the chart halfway through the reading because it comes out, oh, well, I'm not super sure about the birth time. So we switch the chart and the reading is flawless after that. So that's the kind of stuff that unfortunately we need to nail down. And for anybody who's thinking about submitting friends, family, their own chart to the Astro-Babble, just be aware that without that exact birth time, we're going to need to do a one-on-one consultation to rectify it if you're not sure, especially with that 0-degree ascendant, Sheila. So just be aware, laying the groundwork might not be as accurate because you're right on the edge. But that Leo ascendant does put the moon as the ruler of the chart. This is where we get into finance for Sheila. The sun is at Sheila. Sheila, you're killing me. Sheila, your sun is at 29 degrees 58 seconds in to Virgo, on the absolute cusp of Virgo, just like your ascendant. You really, if this is your correct birth time, you live life on the edge, girl, on the absolute edge. And it's very difficult for you to understand your astrology because you're so on the edge. That solar placement as the ruler of your chart, right on the edge of turning into Libra. Very, very, very nuanced astrology that we would need to work out one-on-one for sure. But again, if this is the birth time, we have the North Node as well as Uranus and Venus. Venus also at 29 degrees, stop it, right on the cusp of that 30-degree house and whole sign. So we have the North Node in the first, Uranus in the first, Venus in the first, all indicating that the self is really what needs to be worked on this time around. Uranus in Leo is a fun placement. I enjoy seeing it. It gives a lot of bombastic nature to the personality, a lot of Leo flair in an unpredictable Uranian way. And Venus in Leo is something that I also like to see. It's not Venus's favorite sign, but I think she can rock a really, really high Italian hairdo. Get that beehive on with that Venus in Leo. I think that's a beautiful place for you to have it in the first house as well, giving you tremendous confidence, giving you the ability to pursue who you are with a lot of vigor with that North Node placement. And that's something that I really enjoy seeing with the North Node, because the North Node tells us where we're going in the chart, what life direction we're taking. And for you to have Uranus and Leo, a very strong self-identifying placement, the sun ruling the chart, and Venus and Leo all in the first house, that's beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. But the sun, the ruler of the chart, is in the second of finance. So we find a very strong identification with money. We find a very strong identification with wealth, potentially hoarding, especially because that Pluto in Virgo is in the second house. Hoarding tendency is definitely part of that equation. When we see Pluto, that underworld energy, in Virgo, that organizer, somebody who tends to package and box away, but put those boxes underneath. And really hide things from view in the second house. That can be really, really beneficial when it comes to saving money, for sure. I enjoy that placement financially. I really do. But it is this idea of hoarding that comes to the surface in the second house. It's a valid approach to using money. We just need to make sure that you don't get too miserly. There's an interesting conjunction happening in Mars and Mercury in Libra in the third house. Mars is in fall in Libra, which isn't super great. But when it's touching Mercury in Libra, Mercury does like to be in air signs for sure. And so that Mercury being touched by Mars, I think gives a very quick mind. I think makes the mind rather indecisive. So although the mind is quick, it does tend to spin its wheels quite a bit. As any Libra placement is bound to do. Libra is a beautiful sign when it comes to appreciating beauty, to weighing the options, to keeping the peace. But when it comes to kind of nailing down an accurate decision, nailing down an outcome, Libra would prefer not to choose because everything is beautiful. Libra also loves to play devil's advocate. So having Mercury, the planet of the mind, in Libra conjoining Mars, that action potential planet, does give you a little bit of a slight disadvantage with the mind going into circles and that monkey mind needing to get a little bit more meditation in than most, Sheila, especially with that 1 degree conjunction being in that third house of writing, teaching, communication. This is an interesting placement that I'd like to talk about. We have Jupiter at 27 degrees in Capricorn in the sixth house of work, health, pets. That Jupiter is stationing, and then Saturn is at 23 degrees and retrograde. So Sheila actually just went through her second Saturn return with that placement. So there's a good coming of age story, a second maturation of that Saturn energy in the sixth. But when I see Saturn in Capricorn retrograde in the sixth, it's somebody who's very precise about their work. It's somebody who's very detail oriented. It's somebody who tends to be very much in it for the long haul. They stay at jobs for a very, 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 very long time because they're invested in what they do for a living. They put their roots down very firmly and they just do not move, sometimes to their detriment, especially because Jupiter would like some expansion in this house, but is in the sign of its detriment in Capricorn. So it keeps that Jupiter small. Playing small in the workspace is something that I see a lot with this placement as well. We do need to be aware that Saturn retrograde in Capricorn with Jupiter in Capricorn gives us joint issues potentially, especially with Jupiter representing that expansive property, rheumatoid arthritis type symptoms. The joints becoming arthritic and knobby early in life can potentially be part of the health equation of the chart, something that we would need to look at just a little bit. But that's largely going to be because of movement and diet, because of that Leo and Virgo influence in the chart. We do have a moon in Pisces in the eighth, which I think is lovely for Sheila. There's a good intuitive spin to the chart. Whenever we see that moon in Pisces in the eighth house of death, there is clairvoyant or mediumship abilities present in the chart, but also going out on her own from an entrepreneurial standpoint, working in the fields of estate taxes and estate taxes, potentially law. That's something that I think Sheila would actually be very, very good at. She has an intuitive knowing of working with those aspects of the eighth house. And yeah, I think that's a good summary of Sheila's chart. Thank you, Sheila, for donating your chart. We just do need to be aware that all of that would need to be scrapped if the birth time is not correct. Okay. Yes, so thank you for jumping on. I'm looking at the comments and messages. Thank you everybody for submitting your birth dates, places, and times. If you'd like to be a part of the forecast or the live stream, just give me your birth date, place, and exact birth time. We'll throw you in the queue. The queue is long, but I do 8 charts a day, so I'm blowing through them pretty quick. And if you would like to schedule a private consult, just go to ScorpioRisingAstrology.com. and you'll be able to see all that, as well as online courses. If you enjoyed your chart reading and would like to send me a little gift via PayPal, you can always PayPal me, sam@ScorpioRisingAstrology.com. Or buy a class or sign up for an online a virtual consult, and we'll get your chart all read. Okay, so let's talk about Sharon. Sharon was born 8:33 p.m. in Key West. Oh, Sharon, I like that. That's cool. So we have the ascendant in Libra. Venus in Libra this morning seems to be a really big theme. We have the moon in Libra, also at 4 degrees in the first house, making the emotions very, very present for Sharon, more so than other people. And this is something that this is something that I really enjoy explaining from an astrology standpoint, is some people are like, oh, I'm such an emotional person. And I say, yes, you totally can be to a certain degree. However, when we see the moon in the first house of self, that's a real identification with the emotions. When we see a lot of water energy in the chart, that's also a surge of a lot of emotions. But here we see the moon in Libra in the first house, and that's definitely Sharon needing to be a little bit more in touch with the emotional side, because that is something that her chart really, really dictates. The ruler of her chart is Venus in Pisces, the sign of its exaltation, but it is slightly combusts the sun. So the sun is at 27 degrees of Pisces, and we have Saturn here in Pisces in that sixth house of work. Makes for a really interesting work dynamic for Sharon. I don't love that, but I think it can be used to your advantage, Sharon. So Venus in Pisces naturally brings a lot of loveliness and a lot of gushiness and a lot of that watery energy into the workplace. But also from a health perspective, we might see some lymphatic issues because the sun is here. Venus is here, which adds a lot of water energy to whatever it's at. And then Saturn, that restrictive principle, I think regularly going for lymphatic drainage, making sure that you're up on your water intake and eating watery foods, especially from the vegetable area. Yeah, plant-based diet for sure, because kidneys, Libra is ruling your first house of body. And then we have Virgo here, that picky sign with Uranus, Pluto, Mars here retrograde in the 12th house of hospitalizations. I think if something does go wrong in your chart health-wise, it's very much connected to the lymphatic filtration systems of your body, because we have kidneys, Virgo being secondary ruler of liver, and Pisces the lymphatic, all those filtration systems lighting up in your health houses. And also, the ruler of your chart being in a health house gives you a really good identification with the healing professions. But please note that the phrase physician heal thyself, or in more appropriate cases, healthcare worker heal thyself, that's going to be a mantra that you cannot let slide, honey, because you've got the same markers for health issues in the people that you would eventually treat. And if you're not working on yourself health wise, then you're not going to be able to help others. But also, because these houses are so interconnected, there's this idea of you specifically learning how to heal others through the health issues that you've had to overcome. But again, I think it really goes back to maintaining your kidneys hormones via Libra, your lymphatic system, as well as feet, via that sixth house of work in Pisces, and then Virgo on the 12th house of hospitalizations, that small intestines, liver. If we keep those body systems happy, you're absolutely golden. From a sixth house work perspective, we do find difficulties at work, because Saturn is here. That Saturn would mature at about 30 and 60, so that will get easier. But because the Lord of the chart is here, we do find a little bit of a workaholic tendency with Sharon, and over identification with work, because we have the Sun here as well as Venus here. And Saturn produces a very hard worker, but boundaries are an issue for Sharon at work as well, because Pisces doesn't like to be withheld. Pisces doesn't like to maintain proper, like, social distancing, to use a term that's being thrown a lot around right now. I think we need to be aware that the Pisces in the sixth, we need to seriously lock down some of your boundaries at work, Sharon, because that's a weak point in the chart. Seventh house Mercury in Aries is an interesting relationship placement, being attracted to somebody who's very intellectual, but also who's very, very driven, somebody who's very orderly, somebody who might also work in the 12th house fields of hospitalization, rehab, jails, working with hidden enemies, or potentially in psychology or psychiatry, the professions where people are often at their wits' end, on death's door, being exiled away. That's something that you're actually very attracted to in a partner, because there is a certain amount of power that needs to be had with that, but also mental sharpness that you're very, very attracted to via that seventh house Mercury. Because the ruler of your chart is also ruling the eighth house of death, taxes, estates, and business, as well as Jupiter in Taurus being in that eighth house, I think you do very well as an entrepreneur starting your own business, especially if it involved the caring or the healing professions, like we already talked about. That Jupiter does bring bounty to anything that it touches, especially because Venus and Jupiter are in mutual reception. So Venus is in Jupiter's sign of Pisces, and Jupiter is in Venus's sign of Taurus. The connection between the sixth house of work and the eighth house of death is even more prominent. Again, working in the fields of hospice, working in end of life care, working in hospitals, definitely part of that. But you'd really succeed in any eighth house topics that you choose to pursue, whether those be death, taxes, estates, business. That's all within your purview of power, is a good way to say it. You'll definitely be known for your compassion as well, because that moon in Libra is ruling that 10th house of success and legacy, is a good way to think of it. So I think that you have a really prominent drive to make an impact on the world, Sharon. But when we look at where your chart is actually pointing you, one of the things that you'll need to consider is the ninth house, because that North Node is in Gemini. We have travel, higher education, and working with foreigners as a big part of your chart dynamic. And so when we unpack what you should be working towards, it should be those ninth house topics, especially if it involves your spouse or relationships, because Mercury is ruling that ninth house, and Mercury is in your seventh house of relationships. So starting a travel business with spouse, or working in higher education with spouse, definitely something I would recommend. Thank you, everybody, for joining me for the live stream. Everybody on Instagram and Facebook. We've got 3 more charts in about 15 minutes to do it. So let's go to Louise. So Louise was born 4:20 p.m. in Enfield. Oh, and we've got a Capricorn we've got a Capricorn stellium and a Scorpio stellium. Goodness, Louise. Goodness gracious. So we have the ascendant in Cancer. The ascendant in Cancer is being ruled by the moon in Scorpio in the 5th. I like that. I actually really, really, really like that. That immediately talks about personification personification of parenting, identifying as a parent. You would also be a very good parent with Cancer ruling the ascendant of self. Like it just naturally makes you a caregiver and somebody who's really able to put the needs of others before their own and get that mama bear energy. But that Scorpio moon in the 5th ruling the chart definitely solidifies the idea of parenting being very, very important to you personally. But there are some issues here. We do have the South Node, we have Saturn and Pluto all in Scorpio in the 5th house. So although children and parenting is going to be right up your alley, especially emotionally, very, very fulfilling, there will be a lot of very intense challenges. And those challenges are going to come potentially because, again, Scorpio from a medical perspective does rule the reproductive system. It wouldn't surprise me if you had large amounts of birthing trauma, because Pluto does rule death as a force, and Saturn does rule restriction, and the South Node does rule kind of the energy suck of the chart. There might have been multiple complications in labor. Although you might be a fantastic parent, you do find it absolutely draining. And from a physical perspective, although there are fertility markers in the chart, having Pluto, Saturn, and the South Node here means that you might be a great parent, but you might not be able to have children of your own because of those medical issues. And so we would need to look at adoption or secondary childcare, especially with Mars ruling the 5th house. And Mars is up in that 9th house of foreigners. That's something that I see a lot in adoption cases, or inheriting children is a good way to say it, because Mars is in that 9th house of foreigners, and Mars is ruling that 5th house of children. So he finds that there's a inheriting of children or a adopting of children from other countries outside of your own. We also see that maybe a parent might be a foreigner as well, because fifth house rules parenting, but also parents. Let's see. So that really pretty much unpacks the fifth house. There's a lot to talk about there, but it basically talks about that parent aspect being super, super important. Then we have the sun in Capricorn, we have Jupiter in Capricorn, we have Mercury in Capricorn, we have Neptune in Capricorn, all in that seventh house of relationships. So let's talk about that hubby, shall we? Or that wifey, or that spouse, significant other, because there's a lot of restriction here, my dear. There's a lot of holding back. There's a lot of sternness. There's a lot of construction. There's a lot of legacy, but there's also a lot of coldness, is a good way to say it. We do have the sun here, so there is an identification with relationships. Being in a relationship does fuel the ego. And again, I think that goes back to the parenting aspect that the moon in Scorpio in the fifth represents. You identifying very strongly, not just as a parent, but also as a spouse. And that's where a lot of your ego fire comes from. Jupiter being here, though, being in a relationship does fuel your ego, but it does also repress the ego to a certain extent. So we need to be aware that relationships don't become disempowering, that your relationships, although you might have a large and successful relationship, that you don't feel like you're having to give up who you are because of who you are with. The person that you are attracted to, though, has very Capricornian tendencies. We have Mercury in Capricorn, Neptune in Capricorn, both known for the mental aspect, the subconscious aspect, potential escapism tendencies in the spouse. So it wouldn't surprise me if your significant other likes to lose themselves in their quote unquote man cave, or get into that digital world, or potentially use substances to escape the conscious mind, as it were, and potentially leave you behind. And that can be something that we find a little bit of issue with in the chart, is the spouse needing to go off on their own mental adventures and leaving you to take care of some of the things that are in your chart, like the parenting stuff, for sure. That's a little bit of an issue. Not really too fond of that. But if you're able to work with that Capricornian energy in the spousal fifth house well, then that can be a really long relationship, a really long-term relationship. A lot of good babies from that, because Jupiter is in the sign of Capricorn, being ruled by Saturn in Scorpio in the fifth house of children. So there is good marker of children occurring from the spouse. Yeah. We do have stay-at-home mom markers in the chart, not just because of the moon ascendant, but also because Jupiter is ruling Sagittarius, the sixth house of work, and Uranus is here. So work is going to be really unpredictable for you, Louise. It always has been, always will be, but it will be intimately connected to the spouse. So working for your spouse of choice, definitely in the cards. Like doing the bits and bobs and the odds and ends that are really unpredictable, but also help to pay the bills. That's a big part of the chart. But also your house of finance is intimately connected to your house of relationships. So there's always going to be a financial gain from your relationship connection. Excellent. Yeah, so we have just 8 minutes and I think 2 other charts that we need to do. So let's continue to move on. If you would like to be a part of the queue, just send in your birth date, place, time via private messenger, and we'll get you on that. Let's look at Gerard. Oh, Gerard. Woo! Gerard. Goodness gracious. A Capricorn goddamn stellium. Absolutely ridiculous. So we have the sun, so we have Uranus, so we have Neptune, so we have Venus, so we have Saturn, so we have the North Node, all in Capricorn, all in the 11th house. Absolutely ridiculous. That is a super stellium. And this is where we get very, very confused with people like Gerard, or people like Gerard get very confused with astrology. Because Gerard walks in to... he doesn't walk into a horoscope. He tries to read his horoscope, and we have we have the sun in Capricorn and all this Capricorn energy. So Capricorn is a really big part of Gerard's chart. Like he's an uber Capricorn, but we also have this Pisces side of Gerard. And this is what we need to be aware of when the planet that rules the chart, the planet that rules the ascendant is not the sun or is not in the sun's sign. Yeah. So we have this Capricorn stellium up in the 11th, which is what we're going to get to in a minute. But let's backtrack a little bit and talk about how Gerard is not necessarily Capricornian, because the ascendant is in Pisces, and the ascendant of Pisces is ruled by Jupiter in Leo in the 6th. So this is where Gerard gets his workaholic tendencies from. This is where Gerard gets his obsession with health, of business, of pets as well, working with our fuzzy friends or having a lot of aminals, especially exotic aminals with that Leo placement. And that Jupiter in Leo is retrograde, so there is a little bit of an issue with work. You know, I love work, but I hate work. A love-hate relationship with that dynamic for sure. But everything does go back to that 11th house, and this is where it gets really, really fun, is we have that Jupiter in Leo ruling the 10th house of career success, so being very good at what Gerard does. I really enjoy that, but we have this sensitive side to Gerard that needs to be respected, this intuitive side to Gerard that needs to be respected, but we have this major, major Capricorn stellium up in the 11th. So when we have more planets in a particular sign, right, that means that there's more of that sign and that houses energy in the chart, in the native's life. So the 11th house is the house of friendships. It's the house of social groups and humanitarian efforts. So to have the sun here, we automatically find that Gerard has a really humanitarian nature. Gerard views his friends very, very highly. That's a very important part of who he is as a person, is the groups that he associates with. The groups that he associates with, though, vary greatly. We have the Uranian groups that he associates with, which are those free thinkers, those people who are really on the edge, the leading edge of their fields, who are very genius oriented. Then we have those Neptune friends, which are kind of the stoner friends, the spiritual friends, the hippie friends, as it were. Then we have the Venusian friends, the friends that are just really high quality, the friends that are really just lovely, the friends that are really just about supporting and nurturing, you know, really, really strong friendships there from an emotional perspective. Then we have the Saturn and Capricorn friends, which are really about keeping Gerard on track, the people that help to be the buffers in his lane to make sure that he doesn't go out of his field of expertise, of which he has specialization tendencies for sure. But I think that because the 11th house of friendships, social groups, and humanitarian efforts is so lit up in Gerard's chart, we have very interesting dynamics here, with that being a core part of who he is as a person, his work life, as well as his long-term success, for sure. Interesting when it comes to all of his work houses being connected to the 11th house of large groups, but his money comes from somewhere different. And that's something that I really love about astrology, is although astrology can talk about what you do for a day job and what you'll be known for legacy-wise, that may be totally different from where you get your money. And so we have the second house of finance being ruled by the third house of writing, teaching, communication, something that Gerard actually loves to do because his moon is in Taurus, the sign of its exaltation, here in the third house of writing, teaching, communication. Mars is also retrograde in Taurus in the third house, not necessarily ideal. So he's going to have some trouble getting things out, getting things down on paper. There's going to be hesitation. There's going to be a lack of confidence from a writing, teaching, communication standpoint. But where Gerard actually gets a boatload of cash is when he steps up to the podium and when he actually allows some of the work experience that he's accrued over his lifetime to shine, and to really talk about those experiences with the passion and the fervor that we know he has, especially with the large groups being such a big part of his chart. He has the charisma to do just that if he just gets over this afflicted Mars in the third house. I think those confidence issues aren't a big stumbling block, but if he just lets the mouth open and lets the tongue wag and just starts talking, he has that natural charisma and that ability to speak, which draws people in, and he knows what the hell he's talking about for sure. Hey, Tomas. Hey, Luis. Thank you, everybody, for jumping on. We've got one more chart and just a couple minutes to do it, so we'll wrap this up rather quick. Let's talk about Jacob's chart. So Jacob was born 3:44 a.m. in Limerick. And I'm a fan of Jacob's chart. Oh, this is really interesting. Very spread out, very individualistic, multiple rulerships present. I love it. So we have the ascendant in Libra. Whenever Libra is on the ascendant, there is a beauty to the face, to the body. There is a natural symmetry. There is a natural Venusian slant to Jacob's body, as well as an athletic slant as well. Wouldn't surprise me if he competed in local neighborhood sporting events. When we look at Jacob's chart, the beauty that's present via Libra also has some restriction because of Saturn. Although Saturn is in its exaltation in Libra, I think that although Jacob has a natural beauty to his frame, to his structure, to his body, there's going to be a deeper beauty that emerges over time. This is definitely somebody that I would watch via modeling, or who would stay or who should stay very, very close to a camera throughout the life. Because I think the older Jacob gets, the prettier the prettier he's going to get as well, because of that Libra and that Saturn in Libra. He's going to age very well, age very gracefully. From a personality standpoint, though, we do have Saturn infused in the self, which is not an easy thing to grow up with. Saturn only matures around 29 and then halfway through the life around 58, 60. So to have that so close to the self, there's going to be this late bloomer energy in Jacob that I think the Libra energy will mediate. He'll have this good physical charisma, this beauty that everybody's attracted to, but there's going to be this side of him that just feels uncomfortable in his own skin, feels like he's not where he wants to be until about 30, and then his sense of identity will start to really recover. But that's the difficult thing that I find with a lot of heavy Libra placements in the chart, is they're thrown into the spotlight, they're appreciated for talents that they naturally have, even though it's not what they like to do, even though it's not what they love to do. As an example, there's a lot of synastry in Jacob's chart between the ninth house and the third house. So we have this interplay between the moon being in Gemini in the ninth and Mercury in Sagittarius in the third, the ruler of the chart, Venus, also in the third, and the North Node in the third. So one of the things that Jacob's going to need to pursue throughout his lifetime is writing, teaching, and communication. That's something that we really, really, really need to see in the chart. And in fact, it wouldn't surprise me if he, over the life, starts to write, teach, speak internationally, starts to interact a lot more with foreigners or higher education. And I think this is something that he potentially gets from dad as well, because a lot of the personality traits are because of that fourth house connection to Saturn being in the first and ruling Capricorn and Aquarius in the fourth house of family, fifth house of parents. So there's a lot of really strong talent in Jacob's chart, but it's talent in that third house quality of writing, teaching, communication, where a lot of that loveliness is accessed. So we need to be very aware of that side to Jacob's chart, and to not just recognize the superficial beauty of Jacob, but to understand that the talents that he wants to pursue are going to be a little bit buried, are going to be a little bit different from what people see on the surface. And that's a lot of what we see with the Scorpio sun too. We've got Jacob's sun in Scorpio in the second house of wealth and finance, being ruled by Mars in the 12th. So that's tricky. It's just a tricky placement for identity. But again, monetary rulership, something that Jacob is going to need to work with throughout the life. Sun being in the second house, money nourishes the ego, but because the sun is ruled by Mars and Virgo in the 12th, there's this idea that money for Jacob is the root of all evil. When it comes to corrupting the self via monetary gain, we would need to extract or exercise some of the wealth from Jacob so that we don't spoil that beauty via monetary pursuits. That moon in Gemini, though, I think it really speaks towards traveling abroad. I think it really speaks towards being drawn to foreign culture, especially with the talent that we see in the third house. Learning, higher education, going to be very, very important for Jacob's chart. The more that Jacob puts into learning about other cultures and the way that other people do the talents that he's naturally gifted in, the more he's going to grow and the more he's going to thrive from that dynamic, because I think he not only has the talent, but he has the ability to learn so much from others that the more he gets tutelage, especially from other cultures, in the things that he's interested in talent wise via that third house of writing, teaching, communication, he's just going to be really, really good at it. I look forward to seeing how Jacob develops. I look forward to seeing how his chart unfolds, but there are some plot holes that we need to just be aware of as well. Cool. Thank you, everybody, for jumping on. I appreciate you joining me for this other round of Astro-Babble. I am Sam Bellier, an astrologer. If you would like to schedule a private consult, you can always go to scorpiorisingastrology.com. Check out the online courses I have on astrology if you're interested in learning. But also, if you'd like to be in the queue for these live streams, just send your birth date, place, and exact birth time to me, and I will add you to the queue. If you'd like to look at previous live streams that I've done, you can always Google scorpiorisingastrology.com or search for scorpiorisingastrology.com on YouTube, where I have the replays, and I'll post the YouTube link in the comments once the replay for this video is up, so you can see that on Facebook. But if you want to follow on Instagram, it's at Scorpio Rising Astrology, but Instagram only lets me film about an hour. But I do the daily forecast as well on Instagram, which Facebook, the algorithms tend to shove that to the bottom of the queue. So follow me on multiple places. I'm here. I'm around. We're going to do this every morning at 10:30 Eastern Standard Time. And we will see you tomorrow. May the stars be ever in your favor.